Antonio Gramsci was an Italian writer, politician, and political theorist. He was one of the founders of the Communist Party of Italy and later served as its leader for a period of time. In 1926, under Mussolini's fascist regime, Gramsci was arrested and imprisoned. Much of Gramsci's work focuses on culture, political leadership, and the ways in which power is maintained within society. From an academic perspective, he is particularly important because he developed a highly original approach within the Marxist tradition. Rather than simply following materialist dialectics, he developed what he called a philosophy of praxis. He is also widely known for his concept of cultural hegemony, which refers to the ways in which a dominant class can maintain political and social power within a capitalist society. During his years in prison, Gramsci produced more than 30 notebooks and approximately 3,000 pages of writing on history, politics, culture, and social analysis. These writings are now known as the Prison Notebooks. They contain his reflections on Italian history, nationalism, Marxist theory, critical theory, and education. Two ideas are particularly important for understanding Gramsci's thought. The first is the concept of hegemony, which he understood as a way in which the capitalist state could maintain its power. The second is the idea of the organic intellectual, whose role would be closely connected to the development of an educated and politically conscious working class. The concept of hegemony was not entirely new. Marxists such as Vladimir Lenin had already used the term to describe the political leadership of the working class in the context of a democratic revolution. However, Gramsci developed the concept in a new direction. He was particularly interested in explaining why the socialist revolution that orthodox Marxism had predicted as inevitable had not taken place in Western Europe at the beginning of the 20th century. His argument was that capitalism maintained its power in ways that went far beyond direct violence or political and economic coercion. In other words, domination did not depend only on force. It also operated at the ideological and cultural level. The capitalist system was able to establish a hegemonic culture in which many bourgeois values came to be understood as common sense, as if they were simply natural, normal, and universally accepted ways of understanding society. This produced what we might call a culture of consent. Under these conditions, members of the working class could come to identify their own interests with those of the bourgeoisie. Instead of challenging the ruling class, they could therefore participate, consciously or unconsciously, in maintaining the existing social order. For Gramsci, this was one of the central mechanisms through which the status quo was reproduced. His response was that the working class needed to develop a culture of its own. This would challenge the assumption that bourgeois values were simply natural or normal values for society as a whole. A distinct working-class culture could also bring oppressed groups and intellectuals into the broader political project of the proletariat. For Gramsci, therefore, culture was not something secondary to political struggle. It was fundamental to the acquisition and exercise of power. He argued that any social class seeking to become dominant under modern conditions would have to move beyond its narrow economic interests. It would need to develop what Gramsci called intellectual and moral leadership. At the same time, it would have to establish alliances and compromises with a wide range of social groups and political forces. Gramsci described this broader alliance of social forces as a historic bloc, using a term associated with the French thinker Georges Sorel. The historic bloc provides the basis for consent within a particular social order. It is through this network of institutions, social relationships, and ideas that the ruling class is able to produce and reproduce its hegemony. Gramsci also believed that, in Western societies, bourgeois cultural values were deeply connected to Christianity. As a result, much of his criticism of hegemonic culture was directed toward religious norms and values. This theory of hegemony is closely connected to Gramsci's understanding of the capitalist state. In his view, the state does not govern exclusively through force. It also depends heavily on consent. For this reason, Gramsci argued that we should not understand the state simply as the government or as the formal political institutions of a country. Instead, he distinguished between what he called political society and civil society. Political society refers to the sphere of political institutions and legally constituted forms of domination. Civil society, on the other hand, refers more broadly to what is often considered the private or non-state sphere, including areas such as the economy and social organizations. In simplified terms, political society is associated primarily with force, while civil society is associated primarily with consent. However, Gramsci emphasized that this distinction is conceptual rather than absolute. In reality, the two spheres frequently overlap. What matters is that people experience government as legitimate and believe that it governs with some degree of collective consent. Gramsci also argued that modern capitalism allows the ruling class to preserve its economic power while making limited concessions to other social groups. For example, demands made by trade unions or major political parties within civil society may be incorporated into the political system. These concessions can give workers the impression that they have some meaningful influence over their own circumstances. Yet, at the same time, they may continue to vote for representatives of the dominant class, and thereby participate in the reproduction of the existing political order. Gramsci described this process as passive revolution. In this form of political change, the bourgeoisie can move beyond its immediate economic interests and adapt the forms through which its hegemony operates without fundamentally losing its position of dominance. Gramsci's work on hegemony also led him to reconsider the role of intellectuals in society. One of his most influential ideas was the concept of the organic intellectual. Gramsci famously argued that, in one sense, everyone is an intellectual because everyone possesses intellectual and rational capacities. However, not everyone performs the social function traditionally associated with intellectuals. For Gramsci, modern intellectuals were not simply people who gave speeches or produced ideas. They were also organizers and leaders. They helped shape society and contribute to the production of hegemony through institutions such as education and the mass media. Gramsci also distinguished between what he called the traditional intelligentsia and organic intellectuals. Traditional intellectuals tend to see themselves, often incorrectly, as a social group that exists independently of class structures. Organic intellectuals, by contrast, emerge from within particular social classes and express the experiences, values, and interests of those classes. Their role is to articulate, through culture and language, experiences and forms of knowledge that ordinary people may not have the means to express for themselves. This idea is closely connected to Gramsci's views on working-class education. If the working class was going to challenge bourgeois hegemony, it needed to develop its own intellectuals. But these intellectuals should not simply impose Marxist ideology on workers from the outside. Instead, they should build upon the intellectual activity and cultural knowledge that already existed within the working class. In this sense, education should encourage workers to become more critically aware of their social and political circumstances. Organic intellectuals would therefore emerge from within the working class itself and use the values and experiences of working-class culture to contribute to a broader proletarian consciousness. Gramsci also believed that challenging the dominant ideologies of educated and ruling classes required Marxists to develop a more sophisticated understanding of political and philosophical debate. They needed not only to promote their own ideas, but also to genuinely understand the perspectives of their opponents. For Gramsci, one of the most effective ways to achieve this was through education, specifically by introducing elements of socialist thought into working-class culture rather than treating socialism as something imposed from outside. In this respect, Gramsci's ideas about education anticipated later developments in critical pedagogy and popular education. His approach has often been compared with the educational theories and practices developed decades later by the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. Even today, Gramsci remains an important reference point for scholars and practitioners working in adult education and popular education. At the same time, Gramsci's work has attracted significant criticism. Some critics argue that his theory promotes a conception of political struggle in which power is pursued through the control and transformation of ideas and culture. They see connections between this approach and more recent academic debates, including controversies surrounding political correctness. From this perspective, some critics believe that a Gramscian approach to culture and ideology can come into tension with the principles of open inquiry, intellectual pluralism, and liberal scholarship traditionally associated with the classics of Western culture. Whether or not one accepts these criticisms, Gramsci's work remains highly influential because it raises a fundamental question about the nature of political power. Power is not maintained through force alone. It can also be maintained through culture, institutions, education, and, perhaps most importantly, through the ideas that people come to accept as common sense.